Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Daily Bruin Alumni Network Winter Workshop. I'm Sara Salam, and I will be leading this presentation along with Maryia. Today, our topic is going to be on career branding, how to market yourself for a job search. Now, this is just one part of job hunting, job searching, etc. And so this will be the focus of the presentation. However, we will be talking about how to integrate this particular aspect of job hunting into your greater search throughout the presentation. So just keep in mind that is the goal for today. So on to, here we go. So as I mentioned, my name is Sara Salam. I graduated from UCLA in 2010. I was a member of the sports department at the Daily Bruin from 2007 to 2010. I was the sports editor 07-08 and covered football, baseball, tennis, amongst other things throughout my tenure. That's actually one of the big springboards for my career in sports. I worked for 7 years in professional sports front offices. My first job out of college was with the Boston Red Sox. My first season was 2011, and I left that organization in 2015. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the front office that won the 2013 World Series, which was very exciting. I did wear my ring today. I'm just gonna like shove it in there a little bit if you can see it. One of the cool things about working in front office for organizations that value their employees, everyone gets a ring. So just one of the cool things. Fun fact. After I left the Red Sox, I went on to work for the LA Clippers front office in the NBA for a couple of seasons. I have since left sports, still focusing in human resources and recruiting, which I did for those 7 years, 7 years within sports. And then thereafter, I am now currently a full-time author. I write fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, as well as consult for employers and job seekers alike in the human resources recruiting capacity. So that's just a little bit about me, and we'll get it over to Maryia there to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Sara. My name is Maryia Krivoruchko. I was a member of Daily Bruin A&E from 2007 to 2011, so all 4 years. Definitely some of my favorite memories. I was the A&E editor and the Prime Magazine editor, which is around the time that Prime Magazine started. So like I said, great memories. After UCLA, I became a teacher. So I've actually been in the K-12 education space for the last decade. And I worked at Rocket Ship Public Schools in the Bay Area and then Aspire Public Schools here in South LA after that. And after working for a few years in schools, I went back to graduate school to get my master's in public policy and education policy. And for the last 3-ish years, I've been working at Green Dot Public Schools. My title is talent specialist, and that sounds interesting, I think. And what that actually means is all kinds of projects that are related to teacher talent. So some of that includes recruitment of teachers. My work revolves primarily around selection of teachers to make sure we have the highest quality teachers within all of our school buildings. We're one of the largest public charter schools in LA, 19 middle and high schools. And I also do a lot of other talent related work. So things around retention, supporting teachers new to the profession within our schools. But I've seen many, many resumes throughout my last 3 years. So many resumes, many interviews, and I'm really excited to work with Sara to share some of the best practices that she and I have seen throughout our years. And I put just one fun fact at the end here. I'm an LA Marathon finisher. I'm really proud of that. I finished the LA Marathon in 2018. As some of you know, that's 26.2 miles. I added that number there because we asked you to bring some quantifiable achievements to the presentation today that we'll ask you to share in a little bit. But yeah, I just wanted to add that on there because it's an example of a tangible, quantifiable achievement that you might be able to use on your resume or other branding. So just an example.
All right. Thanks, Maryia.
No problem. And yeah, I'll just quickly touch on norms and Sara will kick us off from there. So we'll ask you to just stay on mute throughout the presentation. You will have an option to go off mute during the interactive portion where you'll get to share some of those tangible achievements if you like, if you're comfortable doing so. Sarah and I know that Zoom fatigue is real in a pandemic, and you're either working from home in a pandemic likely, or you are studying from home, or a combination of all of the above. So camera usage is optional for this webinar. If you'd like to keep it on, that's wonderful. We love to see your faces. If you don't feel comfortable with that and don't want to stare at yourself anymore today, I completely understand. And whatever works for you. We just want to make sure you're able to tune in and listen to the presentation. We will ask you that if you come off mute to share, it's great if you share your camera as well, just if you're comfortable doing so. And throughout the presentation, we encourage you to use the chat box to ask any questions that come up or react to the presentation. There'll also be a Q&A at the end where you can type in your questions or go off mute, whatever makes the most sense for you. And those are all the norms we have. So I am excited for Sarah to take it away.
All right, thanks, Maria. All right, let's get into it. So today we're going to cover mainly 4 major sections. Again, what is career branding? We'll have that group activity where we asked you to come prepared with those quantifiable achievements. We will tie it all together, career branding inside the greater job search process, as well as a Q&A to wrap up the conversation. So what is career branding? It's essentially what it sounds like, career branding. I started using this term kind of colloquially with clients to describe the idea of painting a brand or painting a story that helps a job seeker and even an employer communicate their value proposition and what they bring either to that company in question or to the business world. And so in general, in the more kind of academic term or in the academic sense, career branding is the promotion and advertising of your professional work experience in the form of value propositions to an employer, company, someone in charge of hiring, like a recruiter, hiring manager, et cetera. But more specifically, and this is particularly relevant to the storytelling aspect, it is directly connected to the narrative that you present to potential employers in the context of professional skills and experience. As we said in the initial communication to all of our participants, we always want to keep in mind, what does the hiring manager and or recruiter want to, need to, should know about me? And this is all in the context of the job in question that you're applying to, the jobs plural in question that you're applying to, the companies that you're considering, the industry vertical. These are all things that you should be mindful of as you're putting together your content that is related to those searches that you have going on at any given moment. So some types of career branding content, we have the usual offenders, the resume, the cover letter. LinkedIn profile content has become much more mainstream and used by employers over the last, I would even say 10 years, certainly as long as I've been in human resources and recruiting. I would also argue that other social media in the form of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I'm still not sure about TikTok just yet. Your personal website, really any digital footprint that's out there that could be connected to you or that you could be found via searching through any major search engine is certainly related to and contributes to your career brand. Even though you might not intend for that to be the case, employers, some do this more often than others, but some employers will be very diligent about background checks as it relates to what it is that you're putting out into the world in terms of the content that you can control and the content creation. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the resume a little bit. We did get some questions early on related to some formatting, personal information, the ATSs, which you see there that stand for Applicant Tracking System. So in general, we advise that you keep your resume to 1 page. And that's not necessarily to to ignore any significant accomplishments. It's really just that that's what a recruiter or hiring manager will look at. It's the first thing that they see when they're screening through stacks and stacks of resumes, whether it be a paper stack or clicking through in a system. That's typically what they're going to stop at and make a decision based on. In terms of personal information, and what I mean by personal information is email addresses, phone numbers, home addresses, i.e. physical addresses. We live in a day and age where really all a hiring manager or recruiter needs to do is get in touch with you. So I suggest a phone number and email address will suffice. Sometimes there could be bias in relation to physical location. If a hiring manager is only looking for local people, but they don't necessarily say that. It could automatically weed you out of a process if that's something that you include. So just to be mindful of that. Applicant tracking systems too these days are becoming more and more sophisticated. That being said, there are still companies that use a more, I don't want to say rudimentary, but perhaps more like clunky or maybe not as sophisticated technology to screen resumes. And unless you really know the company or you know somebody on the inside, it's going to be difficult to know whether they have a sophisticated technology or a not so sophisticated technology. So I tend to err on the side of always using text-based documents, meaning Word, RTFs, PDFs. I would stay away from anything graphic, meaning JPEGs, PNGs, things like that, as typically those tend to be harder to scan. Or scanned through as a recruiter. I do see a question here. What are the names of some of these applicant tracking systems? It really depends on the employer. So there are things like JobVite, ADP has their own, Ultimate Software has their own. A lot of times they'll be connected to what are called HRIS systems or Human Resources Information Systems. So alphabet soup all around. And so a lot of times these things will be connected on the back end, and sometimes they won't be. So those are just some to kind of let you know what's out there. If you type in a quick Google search too, there's so many that I haven't mentioned and so many I'm sure that have been created even the last couple of years that can either be standalone or integrated. SAP is another one, SuccessFactors, that has been one on the market recently as well. So the important thing, again, is to make sure that your materials are readable. And again, that goes back to the basics of having something that is text-based and therefore easily readable by systems. Maryia, am I missing anything? Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's pretty much it. There's, Workday is another one that's been increasingly popular. But yeah, definitely to your point, Sarah, there are so many of them out there and it's really hard to predict, who is using what. So it's just important to make sure that your resume is readable.
Great, thank you. Yeah, least common denominator idea, right? Whatever the simplest. It doesn't have to be pretty. Some people like to include their photos on it. I would argue that's what LinkedIn is for now, if that's something you feel comfortable with doing. But for a paper resume, I wouldn't necessarily advise that. Moving on to cover letters, LinkedIn profiles. Again, these are things that tie directly back to the narrative, right? So in terms of the art of storytelling, connecting back to the initial presentation that we had back in the fall, it's really about understanding your reader or your audience. And the same idea applies to building your career branding content. It's really about understanding who your audience is and making sure that you're curating and creating your content accordingly to make sure that you're addressing any questions or concerns that they might have upfront regarding your candidacy for that particular job that you're applying to. And that's always going to be the most important thing. Generally, I like to keep a post-it too on whenever I'm working on a job search or helping somebody. I keep a post-it that asks just that question: what is the most important thing? What is the most important thing for hiring managers or an employer to know about me? Why would they care? Is it important? Is it going to help me get this job? Does it answer those questions? So let's move on. Great. So focusing on the narrative. We want to use the supporting details that are quantifiable. Again, going back to the quantifiable achievements that we asked you to bring to our discussion today. These exist in the form of percentages, dollars, rankings, ratios. It's certainly the case that some jobs are more easily quantifiable than others. The first thing that comes to my mind is an accountant. It's very easy to show how you might save a company business, save a business money, or create new ways to funnel money throughout the organization so that it maximizes productivity, things like that. Sales, again, is another one. It's easy to show how much revenue you generated in a given year, where you sit on the leaderboard, for example. So again, some are easier than others. The key for those maybe that aren't so obvious is the transferable skills. So these are things that are related to kind of a little bit that I just mentioned, but things like selling, writing is a big one, data analysis, number crunching. Those are things that you might perform in one job, but that might not necessarily overtly transfer or be obvious that they apply to a job that you're applying to, but it's your job to identify what those things are and articulate that to a hiring manager or a recruiter. That can get a little bit clunky, but we'll go through that in our activity, which I think will be a little bit more helpful and tangible for us to talk through.
Sarah, we have a couple of questions that came up before the activity, specifically about ATS systems.
Great.
There's some really good questions about formatting. So whether there should be fancy page borders or colored shapes, or whether formatting is even as relevant given ATS system usage. And then there's one more question after that, but I'll pause for now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for raising those. So in terms of formatting, the simpler, the better. Again, going back to the idea of least common denominator, I would ignore shapes, design, anything that is super fancy. Just stick to the words, really. That's the key. I know it sounds a little bit counterintuitive given the technologies and the options perhaps that are available to us, but the simpler the better, especially when you get towards the more sophisticated technologies, when a system will parse through keywords and try to identify different terms that a hiring manager or recruiter has identified that they want to pull from, and therefore prioritize the resumes that include those words. So again, simple baseline, totally just, black, very much like the slides that we have, very black and white, straightforward, just focus on the words.
Thanks, Sarah. And then there's one more question. Is there a website or free service that we can use to run our resumes through to make sure they're readable by ATS systems?
Oh, that's a great question. I am personally not familiar with any, and I haven't been in-house for a while. I don't know, Maryia, if there's any that you use in particular with Green Dot.
No, we don't either. And the only other thing I'll add is Cecile had a great question about like formatting in general. And I will say that it depends where you're applying, but being in the education field, sometimes the demand for teachers, for example, is higher than the supply for certain areas. And in that case, ATS systems don't matter as much. We read every single resume that comes in. And at that point, formatting does matter. So it doesn't mean it needs to be fancy by any means, but it needs to be very clear, and a human will eventually see your resume, right? So just to Sarah's point, make it really clear, black and white is fine, but make sure those quantifiable achievements, everything you want to say is not shadowed by any formatting issues or anything else. You want to have the words and the numbers really stick out.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Obviously focusing on the words is the key here, but to Maria's point, eventually a human will see your resume. A lot of times I've seen employers or hiring managers, recruiters will still print out resumes and bring them with them to an interview in person, for example, which may be a little bit farther along in the process of hiring for a particular open requisition. However, it's still going to be something that represents you. So you want to obviously appear organized, appear detail oriented, check your spelling, simple things that, are intuitive to us, but things that we still need to make sure that are tight when we're applying for positions as well. Very good. Okay, so let's kick off the group activity. For those of you who feel comfortable, we'd love for you to share one, two quantifiable achievements that you'd be willing to discuss with us, and we can have a conversation about whether that's something that we think would be a good add. It could be something that could be added to in terms of including on your resume, and just have a conversation about that. So I'm happy to start. I'd love to share a few statistics. One of the things that I like to put on my resume is that I've hired over 3,000 unique individuals throughout my 7 years working in professional sports. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of resumes that I've seen in a lot of interviews that I've conducted. But that certainly gives, particularly if I'm looking for a recruiter position, that gives a hiring manager an idea of the types of volume that I've dealt with. And not that volume necessarily is the most important thing, but it does certainly articulate a certain scope of experience that I do have. So it looks like we're getting some more questions.
Well, thanks, Marlene, for all the questions. We'll definitely get to those. To your point about the ATS system and who's going to read it towards the end of the presentation. I'll quickly share one as well. I already shared it earlier, but a really simple one might be, I completed the LA Marathon, right? And you can specify that it was 26.2 miles and it's quantifiable, and that is an achievement. Yes, that's more of a personal rather than work achievement, but something as simple as that. And I see Laureen added something to our chat here. Let's see. You're a key player in helping your team revamp your website from scratch. Probably quantifiable, but I'm not sure how. That's a great question. Sarah, do you want to touch on that? And Laureen, is there anything else you'd want to add to that if you want to come off mute, if you feel comfortable?
Yeah, that's fine, Maria. I'll just say that, one of the things that occurs to me is if we had had the foresight to have some sort of comparative analytics from like before the revamp and after the revamp, that, and it's possible that those metrics exist and I just don't know it, but to say like we went from X unique visitors a week or a month to Y, and because it was so much better, so many more people came to visit or spent more time on it or something like that.
Sure, that's definitely true. I absolutely understand that predicament. However, it is still worth mentioning the current traffic that your website is getting, because that is still in absolute terms something that is an indicator of performance. So certainly include that. On your particular team, was there a number of people, like the size of the team, the types of collaborations? Was there any revenue? Is your company a revenue generating company? Did it contribute to any marketing campaigns, any spikes in marketing initiatives, any customer acquisitions? These are kind of the things, because a website too, I guess a more specific question might be, what was the intention of the website? Was it to raise awareness? Was it to bring in more money, acquire new customers?
Yeah, those are all great questions. They don't specifically have to do with my organization, but I'm starting to see now how just like a raw number can be useful and quantifiable too. It doesn't have to be a comparison. So that puts my mind at ease a little bit.
Great, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say too, it is difficult if you're not used to thinking.
Right.
If you're in a job too that isn't super numbers focused, where
not at all.
Right,
yeah.
your contribution
Ours is not at all.
Right, but it's an interesting thought too as we move towards the future, especially when our world is so data driven, right? Even if our jobs aren't necessarily focused on numbers or revenue or anything that is measurable in that way, it's still important for us to understand the impact that we're making. because that's ultimately too, as businesses, going to help us understand how we acquire customers, how we don't, like why we don't, and react accordingly.
Thanks for that, Laureen. We have some great examples in the chat, Sarah. I'll read them out loud. So we have saved, this is by Kamani, saved $3,000 a year in office supplies after remodeling receipt book, implementing a color-coded filing system, and transitioning to online invoicing.
Very cool. That's fantastic. That's a lot of money to save in office supplies. I love that. That's really, I'm sure the administration team was excited about that. That's very cool. I love that. I think that's great. I think that's exactly in the spirit of what we're looking for. It's a great way to show your impact and your ability to save and help the company reallocate those funds in ways that are probably more meaningful to them in terms of making money. So that's fantastic. Very good.
For sure. And I think that number really stands out. When you have a resume of all words, numbers will pop out at the recruiter who's reading them. So that's really important. Marilyn has some points in her resume and she'd like some feedback on the second point. So I'll read the first one first. She managed 7 writers and edited stories to meet daily deadlines as Daily Bruin assistant news editor. And the second point is 36 articles and briefs published in print and online as news intern for a local news outlet. Sarah, any feedback on that second bullet?
Okay, that's great. The 36 again is wonderful. That certainly shows volume. My first thought would be to distinguish between print and online as well, just to kind of break it up a little bit. You can certainly lead with 36 articles and then perhaps as a sub-bullet show how many were print versus how many were online, just to kind of show that emphasis. That would really be my gut instinct in terms of feedback on that particular point. I will say too, going back to the first one, the managed 7 writers and edited stories, I think that's great. You can even get more specific too in terms of the number of stories that you edited, even on a weekly basis, understanding that it probably varies, but if there's an average that you want to share, or even a total, or if it's by quarter, whatever way you want to quantify it that you think makes the most impact, I think is certainly worth considering. I think that's something too that all of us, particularly for editorial staff, whether it be how many stories you've written, how many stories you've edited, a combination of both, any special features, any readership in terms of volume or any particular articles that got specific traction, things like that, I think are certainly referencing on a resume and incorporating into a cover letter or LinkedIn content, because those are certainly skills, especially after you graduate, that are transferable and things that a hiring manager or recruiter will want to know and see value in.
For sure. And Marilyn, the only other thing I would add is using a power verb to start off that bullet. So you want to say what you did, right? And use a really strong verb to describe that. So I think Kanishka, your next one is a good example of that. The verb you use to start it off is created, right? That's a really good, strong way of describing what you did. Created, collaborated, etc. You want to make sure to start off with those types of words. So Kanishka, yours is created a design guide and customizable graphic design template for use on social media platforms. And you're looking for some feedback about how you can quantify something like this.
Great. I would say if the design guide, that's awesome. First of all, congratulations. The design guide, customizable templates, how many templates were included is one way to look at it. How many social media platforms, because I'm sure that there's a multiplier of that. So that could certainly show volume in that regard. In the design guide as well as there's sections. I imagine there's fonts, guidance on graphics, color, things of that nature. I would certainly include in a way that will illustrate the time that you put into this particular project, because that's certainly not an easy feat.
Thank you. I also have a follow-up question. So I guess how far can you take it with things like that? So like you would want to include like I created a design guide with 6 templates for designers or something. But then how far can you take it like for a team of 20 designers, or like, what's the line where they're like, okay, that's a lot of numbers?
That's a very good question. On the flip side, when are we getting inundated with a waterfall of digits? It's a fair question. I think in general, from what I've seen, most people tend to stay away from numbers. I think it is human nature for us to qualify our experiences. So at least to date, I haven't seen anything, or I haven't seen very many resumes where I've felt overwhelmed with numbers. So even that last point that you said, the 6 templates for a team of 20 staffers, I think that is perfectly acceptable. There's 2 in there, right? You can even get to 3, and that is fine. And I do want to make the point too that we're not saying don't don't qualify your experience. That's obviously important too. The point that we're trying to communicate is that we do see a shortage of communicating numbers, and it is simply the best way for recruiters and hiring managers to have some sort of indication of the volume of work that you are performing or contributing. So that's kind of like just from a contextual perspective, where we're coming from. But in the interest of sharing numbers, I think again those 2 are perfectly acceptable to include. Maria, did you have any other thing to add?
No, that's it. And I see Marlene added another comment. Let's see.
Thank you, Kamani, for your question. And Kamisha.
So it looks like you have experience as a supervisor. Your resume included text that says you hired, trained, and evaluated staff and reviewed the work. And there's a critique that you don't have management experience. That's interesting. I'm curious, and Sarah, let me know, you might have other questions. When you say resume critique, did that come from a recruiter? Was it an automated answer response, or how did you receive that feedback? Let's see. Oh, I see Marlene here. From an email. Okay. Sarah, what are your thoughts on that in terms of that type of feedback?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm just reading the chat as well. I have experienced supervisor. That's really interesting. I'd be curious, what was the verbiage that you used in terms of hiring, training, and evaluating staff? I guess I'd be looking for something more specific so that I can comment further. Typically, especially if it's in an email, it very well might be an automated response, like you said. A lot of times recruiters or hiring managers won't give feedback for liability reasons. And that is simply part of the legalities of job searching, unfortunately. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what side you're on. So that's not really something we can control. So what we want to do is focus on what we can control. And again, that's the output that we include in the details that we put forth in terms of our narratives. So Marlene, if you feel comfortable sharing something more specific, you can send me a chat or send me an email. That's totally fine. We can have a conversation offline and kind of talk through more of that if you'd like.
Great. It looks like we have another example, and we will also share our email contact information at the end of the presentation, so you'll be able to reach out to Sarah directly for more information. But from Gail, let's see, execute community outreach projects for 3 programs per month and 2 exhibitions seasonally, including identifying target audiences, communities, and organizations, and drafting customized emails to audiences.
Very good. That's awesome. Very cool. Oh, everyone is so impressive. I just love it so much. So great. Okay, great. So perfect use with with 3 programs per month and 2 exhibitions seasonally. That's great. That's exactly in the spirit what we're looking for. You could even take it a step further in terms of community outreach projects, the scope of what those are, in terms of participants, perhaps, if there's a particular city or town or community that you're working within, if there's, again, like numbers of participants within that, the numbers related to target audiences, if there's a particular size. Some of this information you will have to research. It might not be readily available to you. And in terms of, and then drafting customized emails to audiences, that's great too. Volume, if it's worth mentioning, might be important. Like if you're sending, 50 cold emails a week, that is certainly something to include. Again, kind of tying it back to transferable skills, that's kind of like a sales skill, right? Being able to draft pitch emails, or have a dialogue, or those types of communications are certainly worth mentioning. But those would be that's my immediate feedback.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing, everybody. Those are some phenomenal achievements, like Sarah mentioned in the chat. And yeah, let's keep on rolling. We have a few more things to share.
Very good. Excellent. All right. All right, so tying everything together, again, marketing yourself for a job is all about building a consistent narrative around your career brand. And again, the career brand is your professional narrative, your story, how you promote yourself through the content that you produce that any hiring manager or recruiter or employer will see, connecting it back to your resume, your cover letter, your LinkedIn content, your website, digital footprint, what have you. We didn't get too much into the cover letters or LinkedIn content today. We really wanted to focus on the resumes and help you focus on the quantifiable stuff. That tends to be probably one of the more challenging things for us to articulate. So hopefully you guys found that valuable. Never forget the power of story. Ourselves as journalists, we know the importance of the power of story. And if you can harness that energy into creating your own professional narrative, that's a very unique skill that will certainly set you apart when you're looking for jobs as you graduate, or if you're currently in the labor market. What will differentiate you is that skill and being able to communicate those things to a hiring manager or a recruiter as they're trying to find the best fit candidates for their open positions. Again, to reiterate the idea of transferable skills, that's about identifying the things that you've done that align with the opportunities that you're considering, and how you can articulate those similarities and make it so that an employer can see where you add value to their organization and to that specific role. And of course, focus on the numbers. The consistency is really important too across your career branding content. Again, in the idea of creating a consistent and cohesive narrative, just like we do in storytelling, that's very important. We did mention at the beginning of the presentation how career branding is but one piece of the greater job search process. So Maryia is going to talk a little bit about what's called the 2-hour job search, and which is one additional way that you can help yourself in the search for your next opportunity and learn more about what is out there as well. So I'll hand it off to Maryia.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think this ties in well to a couple of the questions that came up about ATS and how to sort of game the system to make sure your resume gets read. I wanted to just quickly point out a resource. This is a book that we recommend taking a look at if you have other questions about how to make sure your resume gets read. The 2-hour job search, I recommend the 2nd edition by Steve Dalton. And the reason why we recommend this particular resource, and certainly there's other resources out there that recommend the same thing, but once you go in and you edit your resume, everything is branded correctly, you have your cover letter, everything's quantified, your LinkedIn profile looks amazing. Your goal is to have somebody look at that. right? And I think Marlene, you were the one that brought up, how do we get past the ATS system, and how do we get somebody to look at it, to see all of the experience and the numbers and everything else? Unfortunately, for many jobs, there are hundreds, if not thousands of resumes that may come in for a specific posting. And so at that point, it's really a gamble. It's just like gambling, because your odds are really, really low to get your resume read. There's only so much time a recruiter has. The ATS system is looking for specific words. You may not be able to predict what those words are. It's not the best use of your time, right? It is important that everything you submit can be read by an ATS system, but there's some other things that you can do to ensure, or more closely ensure, that it's going to be read. So, and the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of positions get filled internally. They get posted, but there are internal candidates who want to transfer or referrals, right? So the best way of making sure that somebody, a human, gets a look at your resume and your resume does not get screened out is to get an internal referral. And that's a really hefty task, right? Especially if you don't know somebody at that organization, to have somebody vouch for you and to say, hey, this person's amazing, let's move them to the next interview round. That's a lot to ask for. So this particular resource describes a really systematic way. It takes more than 2 hours total, but in 2 hours, it has you set up all of the employers you want to contact and how to look for folks that will be able to serve as your referrals, and how to get them to like you enough to want to refer you. And it's okay if you don't know folks at the organizations. You're going to use your connections and your networking skills, your LinkedIn profile, and lots of different ways of connecting. And again, this is just one resource. This is just a book that works well, and we recommend. There's other resources that describe the same thing, but if you want to ensure that somebody gets to look at your resume and gives you a shot, you're going to want to talk to people. And so this is just a resource that we recommend. And I see some things in the chat here. So Greg, yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn to find referrals, absolutely. It is an amazing social media site, and folks are usually really receptive. Not everybody, but many people are very readily available to help, especially to your point, UCLA connections and alumni. There's also UCLA One, right, where you can message alumni throughout whatever industry you're looking for. LinkedIn is the most used, I would say, social media profile for that, but UCLA One is a great one as well. And you can think of other connections that you might have, previous employers, affinity networks, right? Different alumni organizations and groups. There's lots of different ways of doing that. And thanks, Lorene, for also adding the UCLA One link. If you're not currently using it, that's a great place to start. As well as, of course, LinkedIn, because you're going to find most professionals, or at least somebody you want to talk to from whatever companies you're looking for. So again, this is just a resource, but something we recommend taking a look at if you're struggling to get your resume read by somebody. And Sarah, anything else on this front?
Definitely. Thank you, Maria. And Maria makes an excellent point too. So much of, once you have the content that you're ready to share, you need to be able to have the right people to share it with, right? I am a huge proponent of the idea of weak ties. It's an idea of the peripheral people in your network that aren't necessarily your close family or friends, but they might be a coworker or somebody who you see at a coffee shop every morning on your way to work. Things that somebody you see at the grocery store, a neighbor, things like that, or people like that who might be able to help you, or at least help point you in the right direction in terms of establishing those contacts that might be able to help you get into the door of an organization, and have those conversations that will lead to the promise of an opportunity. So certainly a huge part of the greater job search process.
Right. Great. Yeah, so as promised, we have some contact information here if you have specific questions for Sarah or for me. However, we do have some time and would love to do a Q&A at this point. So feel free to go off mute if you're comfortable with that. If you'd like to drop something in the chat, I see that Cecile already did. Please do so, and we would love to answer anything else that may have come up for you. And Cecile, this is a great question. I think Sarah will have lots of great pointers for you. Do you have any tips on making your LinkedIn profile more eye-catching, maybe specifically with the bio part of your profile?
Ah, yes, the bio. It's one of those things where it's, you know, it could be really easy to write or really difficult. It's kind of one of those double-edged swords. I believe now that there is a word or character limit on I believe it's called the about section. I generally recommend people use this particular part of the LinkedIn profile as a way to write a short bio, something that leads with the experience that they have, whether, you know, they're an experienced e-com manager or an experienced copywriter or an experienced accountant, an entry-level accountant, et cetera. And then from there, explain different experiences that they've had, again, the quantifiable and qualifiable, but sharing some of those achievements there, as well as what the opportunities, if you are looking for open opportunities, what it is that you're looking for. So again, it's kind of just a short way to kind of capture and qualify your experience in something of a log line or short bio. I typically don't like to recommend more than, I don't know, I'd call it 200 or 300 words. I tend to keep it shorter. In the more experienced part of the LinkedIn profile, where you can list certain employers, that's where you can include bullets that you include on your resume, for example. Those things are certainly transferable and transposable, that can be shared and are searchable. I would also recommend too for LinkedIn to list your skills and endorsements, I believe it's called, at the very bottom. Those are things that LinkedIn Recruiter, the recruiter tool that companies pay for to use, that's what they'll search, or that's what they'll match up with their job postings if they use that platform for their job searches. So when you're looking through jobs that you want to apply for, look at that, those skills or endorsements that they list. I believe it's on the right-hand side of any job posting. Make sure that yours match with that, because then that will help you show up higher in the search for candidates when a recruiter is doing so. So those are kind of the two areas I would focus on: the bio section and then the skills and endorsements as a kind of 1-2 for LinkedIn.
And Sarah, we have another question. Kamani wants to know, does it look bad if you don't have a lot of connections on your LinkedIn?
That's a tough question. Especially early in your career, I don't think it's anything that's normal. That's part of growing your professional network. I can tell you, Maria and I were just talking about this. I made my LinkedIn profile in 2009, I think, when it was like still like it was an early thing to do. And I have an exorbitant amount of contacts simply because I was a recruiter and human resources professional, and everybody wanted to be connected with me. And I'm sure Maria has had similar experiences. So I don't think it's indicative of your value. And I really don't think employers look at that. I know I certainly haven't. I don't think that is important when considering a candidate's value or potential in an organization. I certainly focus more on skills and experience.
Yeah. I think so as well. The only other piece I would add is LinkedIn, like all social media sites, works with certain algorithms, right? And so the more connections you do have, the easier it is to find other folks or even message people. If you have like a second degree connection, there's like different degrees of connections that you can have, and some you can message if it's a first degree connection or second degree. There's a lot of different layers to that. So it's not that it looks bad, but it is advantageous to add people that you've worked with, any alumni that you know. Sarah, I think you will echo us on this. If you attended this webinar and send us a nice connection request, we'll be happy to connect with you as well. And we're connected to a lot of people. It's just good to keep networking and build that connection. But make sure you add a connection note instead of just sending something, because to Sarah's point, we have hundreds. After 500, it just says 500 plus, and we might not know why you want to connect. Right. So it is advantageous to build your connections purposefully, but it's not that it looks bad. It's just that you won't be able to access as many other connections if you don't have some to start.
Mhm. And to that end too, I would say there are times where I will get a random connection request and I won't know why. I will say too now that LinkedIn has built up its network. There are so many different sales opportunities. I'm thinking of specifically Sales Navigator. A lot of businesses use Sales Navigator to go out and find new business for their business development efforts. So I'll get, salespeople trying to reach out to me and that kind of thing. And I won't have any connection to them other than we have like maybe 2 or 3 people in common, but I really won't know who they are. So I discourage that kind of behavior. I don't think that's what the platform is for myself. Maybe other folks might think differently. So it's really incumbent on you to decide what you want to use it for. But that's just my personal and professional perspective on it.
Yeah, for sure. Use those connections purposefully, not just at everybody who seems interesting. There's a question, Sarah, you might speak to this. If there's an opinion on whether resume writing services are worth the investment.
That's a great question. It's actually something that part of my business is actually to help folks and clients of mine write resumes, cover letters, LinkedIn profiles, things like that. So it really depends on the service that you use and the person or company that you're working with. Generally, it really just depends on their approach and what it is you're trying to achieve. So it's hard. It's such a difficult time, especially now with so many different technologies, as we alluded to, with the ATS systems and all the algorithms that are out there. So my recommendation would be to try and hone in on what it is that you want to accomplish. Obviously, the goal is to get a job, right? But what is it? What is the pathway that you want to take? And what are the things that you think that you need that you can't do yourself, or you don't think that you're as good at, and maybe want to outsource? That would kind of be how I would approach it.
Yeah. And Marilyn, this is a great question, not a bad question at all. The question is a referral a formal certificate that you get from people, or is it just a connection with someone? And the answer is a bit of both, and it really just depends. For some companies, there's a very formal referral process where if I work for a company and I talk to somebody that is a good fit for a role, I will go in and I'll enter your name and your email, and it will link to your application when you apply. And that is how referrals work. In many places, it's super informal. It's a connection to the recruiter. And it's, just the vouching for the fact that you seem like a great candidate and you should be considered for this role. So it's really somebody giving you the internal kind of recognition that you should move forward in the process. And it really, really varies. And again, that resource, the 2-hour job search, will give you a lot more detail on it. But the answer is it depends. And looks like Gail has a great question. I don't have an educational background in the field I'm trying to pursue, which is marketing. And oftentimes I feel that I'm at a disadvantage competing against those with a degree in marketing. How should I brand myself so that I can appear equally competent with others with a marketing degree? And what do recruiters look for in the job application of someone who has a non-traditional educational background?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's one of those things too, going back to the idea of transferable skills, right? I totally get with the education piece. I'm a political science major, right? I majored in poli-sci and I have a minor in global studies, and I'm a writer, HR recruiter professional, right? So I don't think it's necessarily about the degree, but as so much as it is the skills that you've acquired. And how you apply them to the roles that you're applying for. So it's kind of it's too broad of a question for me to answer at this point, Gail, but if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to have a discussion with you offline about it and see what we can, how to focus in on what you're looking for and how to align your background.
For sure. And I think that I see lots of resumes that aren't aligned to the actual degree. And especially if you have experience, that experience is the most important part, right? So like marketing the things you've done and how they can be transferred to whatever it is you're looking for, I think is much more valuable than a degree, though certainly for certain fields, a degree is a requirement. So I think that it's definitely something that you can use to your advantage in lots of transferable skills in anything you've done if you're looking to make a career change.
I will say too, just on that note, as we look towards the future, obviously today our landscape is the way that it is, but as we look forward, it's, we're moving into a time where continuing education is so readily available to us. I mean, today, look at us now, we're having a winter workshop with alumni and current students, which is just such a wonderful thing and such an opportunity for us to continue to hone and grow our skill sets. And those things, aren't typically or traditionally things that we include on a resume, but I do suspect that those are things that we will be able to share and will become more commonplace, as people begin to expand their skill sets and change careers and things like that. That will certainly become way more common, especially as reskilling and upskilling becomes necessary for just how we live in the world. Even now there's like boot camps, for example, for software engineers is just one example for folks looking to make a career change for a role that has been very in demand, at least the last decade, probably longer. So it's certainly something to keep in mind. YouTube, again, we can educate ourselves, obviously with the idea that we're checking our sources and making sure that we're getting credible information, but there is a lot out there that is available to us to help us grow our skill sets. There are things that we don't necessarily get from traditional employers or traditional education. So those are just things to think about as we move forward into the future and how you might be able to describe those skills that you acquire over time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. You'll see our contact information and some websites if you'd like to learn more. And it was a pleasure getting to chat with you via the chat and those of you that came off mute. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. As I mentioned, my contact information is up there. And my website on career branding. I do have a book on career branding coming out next month if anyone's interested in like more of a deep dive. And I do have an email list as well. So if you were looking for notifications or any tips and tricks, feel free to sign up for that as well. But thank you again. It was such a great opportunity to speak with you and I hope you learned something.